With generative AI, the data economy has been thrust into the limelight, where public and commercial data have enabled unprecedented advances. Historically, the commercial data market has focused on financial applications, and while this still remains the largest market by share of companies, new data gathering technologies and business models are fostering broader applications. Trend analysis platform Exploding Topics estimates approximately 403 million terabytes of data is created daily, or as data analytics software provider Domo puts it, data never sleeps, and some of it is being aggregated for commercial use. Many of these commercial data providers can comfortably be considered dual use and could provide great benefit to IQT's national security partners. Welcome to IQT Explains, a series on the IQT Podcast where we explore global technology trends and their impact on national security to provide insights and unique perspectives. I'm today's host, Ari Chadha, a data scientist here at IQT, and today we're going to explore the commercial data startup ecosystem, or Dataverse, and why IQT is continuing to invest in this space. And I'm joined today by a few of our experts, Diana and Hanyu.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having us, Ari.
Thanks for having us, Ari.
Thanks for being here. And so a few short intros. Diana Keenan is a senior associate on the investment team with a focus on enterprise technologies. Prior to joining IQT in 2022, Diana was at Amazon, where she held product management and corporate finance roles within the company across both Amazon retail and AWS businesses. And then Hanyu Chwe is an associate technology architect on the enterprise technologies team. Hanyu has worked as a data scientist, PhD student, and a think tank researcher covering social media, networks, and computational social science. He has published about the effects of algorithms on information platforms and online dating. And so let's dive right in with a question for both of you. I think, Diana, if you want to start, and then Hanyu, you can follow up. What is commercial data, and where does it fit in, and why are we particularly interested in this space?
Of course, and happy to be chatting about this with both of you today. When we think about commercial data, that terminology does sound a bit rigid, but really we're thinking about data sets and information that is acquired or purchased from commercial entities in the private sector. And this has often been known as alternative data or even third-party or external data, essentially data that is existing out of the confines of a customer's organization. And we see commercial data coexisting alongside what our partners often consider as open source information and being a very good complement to open source information, and sometimes even a mechanism for which publicly available information is able to enter the organizations and hands of our government partners. So we think it occupies a really important space between open source information and other intelligence disciplines and can help unlock new insights and validate findings within information that our partners have. And when we think about In-Q-Tel's investment strategy, historically, we've looked at a lot of these data businesses, and we believe there's a continued opportunity to invest in venture businesses where supplying data is at the core of the business model and the company's value proposition.
Great. That's a really interesting point. Hanyu, do you agree with that?
Completely. I'll also add to what Diana said. Commercial data has always been a vital part of the national security mission for our partners. But there's particular trends we're seeing now in the market and the technology that makes this space even more exciting, both commercially and for our intelligence communities.
Great. That dovetails really nicely into thinking about how the market has changed and where we think the inflection points are. So Diana, maybe you can start us off there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we think about data, and you mentioned this in the introduction, there really is a vast universe of information that continues to grow in terms of volume and relevance. And we think that this information will be critical to help continue to fill gaps within both today's intelligence as well as within the private sector as businesses have increasingly embraced digitization and using data to inform their everyday decisions. So some of the key trends that we've been seeing, and really an inflection that's been evolving in the commercial data market, has in some ways been fueled by the momentum we've seen around AI recently. And we're just seeing an outright increasing in demand for data assets themselves. So we increasingly need an immense amount of data to drive those mission critical insights, decisions, help eliminate bias, and really support what will be the future long-term training data supply chain to fulfill the AI goals that the private sector and the government currently have. And you see this kind of around us in a variety of ways. So there has been strong demand for training data. From what we've seen, OpenAI alone spent more than $300 million on data licensing agreements in the last 12 months. And we do expect that some of the larger technology firms, younger AI startups, and many others to continue to be very eager to invest in training data. And those businesses that have unique data, we think will increasingly be poised to seek more market attention and even valuation upgrades. And you started to see this playing out when Reddit was pursuing their IPO last year, as there was a lot of attention on the company's 2 decades worth of conversational data that had been accumulated from users visiting Reddit, more than 1 billion visits per month. So people are looking at the actual data assets in a very different way and have a great hunger for this information. In the same breath, one of the other big inflections that we're seeing is that the supply of data globally is also increasing and diversifying. So, Ari, as you were saying earlier, we have more data than ever before. And I think what we really need is to understand how we can make better use of that information. So we are living in this increasingly digital world. You have the internet, you have smartphones, sensors, satellite penetration. These have been the trends that have been going on for years. And now there's just increasing interest in new data types as well that fuels AI training demand. Through this research, Hanyu and I also talked to many newer private sector companies that are seeking to monetize their own data assets or helping the private sector bring some of their data assets to the market. And we're seeing that many commercial data companies are creating new ways to engage with customers in terms of how to share their data, increase the discovery of the data, and make some of that consumption and access to the data easier to work with over time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as you're thinking about, human persons data, you mentioned in particular, right? Like that trove of Reddit data. What does the sort of regulatory side of that look like? You sort of think of GDPR as particularly forward-leaning, but are there more, Hanyu, that you've seen?
Yeah. Machine learning, the recent advances in machine learning models have brought a lot of attention into the courts and regulatory processes. I think of it as sort of maybe 2 buckets of different distinct processes. One is the interaction with copyright and fair use laws, whether the training data for large language models is allowed to be used by the creator of those language models. This is a difficult and controversial area of law. I'm not a lawyer, but the regulatory regimes in this area also vary dramatically by internationally. So different countries have more liberal regimes, some different countries have more conservative regimes. And we expect, I imagine that the development of language models will differ dramatically by the court cases in different countries. I think more relevant for commercial data specifically, though, something that we're seeing just in this last year is the FTC has been cracking down on a lot of commercial data vendors, which they believe violate Americans' security and privacy. And so I believe there's been 2 settlements won with data brokers in 2024 alone, Xmode and Xmode successor OutLogic. And FTC is going after another data broker currently in the courts. And so there's a lot of sentiment around in politicians and policymakers that if the FTC is saying these vendors are harming Americans, we should not trust them or work with them, then our government partners and intelligence communities should do the same. And so there's a fine path for our government partners to walk between preserving civil liberties as well as making full use of the availability of commercial data that exists.
And would you say that, a lot of this is in progress, right? So if you had like a sort of a bit of advice for our government partners about thinking about this market, what would it be as far as where to engage and where to look?
Yeah, I think it would be follow FTC guidelines closely. I trust our government partners to be very serious about taking American civil liberties seriously. And I think coordination with the FTC and other parts of governments can really help them do that.
Absolutely. So taking a step back, Diana, could you help us unpack what the venture landscape looks like here and maybe some of our prior investments in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Hanyu raises a really good point on the regulatory side. We are just seeing a more critical lens be applied to many of these business models that we are, as investors and as thought partners to our government entities, are taking very seriously and trying to kind of navigate that tension with what we see as continued growth and opportunity for resources that can be helpful to them with their mission sets. So as we think about how that plays out in the venture capital landscape, we started looking at this market from the lens of the overall global data and analytics market, which tends to include a variety of software and services platforms that allow customers to really optimize systems and processes at all parts of data collection and all the way to the end, insights and analysis. So it is a large market. Gartner sees that as a $150 billion market that is growing in the low teens for the coming years. And that's being sustained by growth of data in a lot of ways, whether it be transactional data, web traffic data, social media information, or even geolocation, satellite, and weather data. When we double click on the venture capital ecosystem for data analytics, we see a smaller portion of that. We see generally about 20 billion in data analytics funding per year in the venture capital ecosystem. And commercial data, as we see it as a universe, is one piece of that. Tends to be about 5 to 10% of that venture-backed data and analytics market in terms of deal count and capital raise. But it is a consistent piece. So while this is not, the largest whale in the ocean, it is a consistent swimmer each year. And in general, we've seen about 70 deals that are commercial data in nature over the last 5 years per year, and more than 2 billion raised each year over the last 5 years as well. We're also seeing that trend in terms of increasing valuation playing out on the venture side. So post-money valuations for these types of businesses have tripled over the last decade, from 36 million on average to north of 100 million. So we think that's quite interesting and an indicator of continued market appetite for these kinds of companies, despite commercial data comprising that smaller portion of the total data ecosystem. Importantly, one thing we really like about this space is commercial data businesses generally see attractive exit opportunities, which is compelling to venture investors like ourselves and those with more of a financial lens. So many of the exits that these businesses experience generally are as profitably privately held companies, even publicly traded companies, sometimes strategic acquisition targets, or later stage private investment. We have a few of these companies in our portfolio that are Series C, Series D, and beyond, which has been quite interesting when we were involved with them at earlier stages. And you can think about businesses more known in the public sphere as S&P Global, Equifax, ZoomInfo, FICO, and Dun & Bradstreet really as kind of example anchors in this space. Where I think In-Q-Tel has stood out with our venture investments historically, we've been investing in commercial data business models for more than a decade, and we've had a history of, as a new data type has emerged, we've been early to introduce that information to our government partners along the way, whether it be some type of novel web traffic information, supply chain data to help our partners understand global supply chains, or even honestly, when you think about dark web information, all sorts of different commercial data sets that can really enrich some of the knowledge bases within our partner community. And we'd like to continue that history because we see that many entrepreneurs and operators are attracted to this space and continuing to innovate here. So it's a space that we plan to continue to pay close attention to as investors.
Wonderful. Yeah. And, as you're thinking about the space, if you talk to money companies, right, and other investors, are you seeing different differences between various industries? Maybe we can start off with you, Hanyu, and then go to you, Diana.
Yeah, one, I think, big difference is we've talked a lot about the influence of language models in the commercial data conversation, but language models have a very distinct type of data. They're trained on conversations, they're trained on language, and that offers, I think, a different set of challenges, both with your data infrastructure and privacy and compliance, than data that's about particular individuals. Or particular individuals or objects or events that exist in perhaps isolation. We often think about data as about a specific person or a unit and the attributes of that unit, like all the variables associated with that person. But conversation exists in the context of others. Conversations are about different people. Their comments are about specific posts. And those require, I think, different frameworks for thinking about both the privacy and compliance, the data infrastructure needs, and different companies exist because of that.
That makes a lot of sense. And as we're seeing sort of a shift from language models to more multimodal models, do you think that changes at all?
That's a great question. I think text specifically tends to be between multiple people. A photo or a video can be produced by a particular person. And of course, within the image, there can be multiple people. But language tends to be more networked than pictures or video. I guess language, like text and audio, tend to be the primary communication platforms. So I would posit a distinction between text and audio, and then pictures and video on the other bucket.
Interesting. Diana, what are you seeing from the investor angle as far as different industries and how companies have navigated their specific niches?
Yeah, well, to follow on from Hanyu's comment, I think one of the exciting things in the juncture we're at in the market is that there's more interest and need for working with and understanding the reams of unstructured data in the market, which sometimes have been, 80 to 90% of the data out there that have not really been utilized and leveraged to the best of our abilities, which creates, I think, really interesting opportunities and challenges longer term, kind of in the data and I space writ large. When we think about where this gets interesting on the commercial data side, historically, many of these business models, as you were saying earlier in the introduction, many of these businesses were very explicitly targeting the financial services industry. So we've seen this market really have its roots in serving that industry, which looks like providing data to maybe quantitative hedge funds or other investors that are embracing new data sources in pursuit of alpha, maybe even providing data to banks and other institutions that need that information for underwriting, credit, and other business decisions. So that was a very specific type of data source that was focused on. But we've really seen the market expanding as more data sources are commercializing. So we're seeing a really new array of information and data sources that are available to buyers that are specialized to certain industries and new verticals. So you see this playing out in real estate, consumer behavior, location services, and even environmental information, which I think is really interesting in terms of where we're at with the broader environment and climate. And we're really seeing also an emergence of new types of data vendors. So no longer just a vendor looking to provide their own proprietary data, but many vendors that are differentiating by providing indirect access to information that they have either through aggregation, marketplaces, consulting, or other business relationships. So we think that will also start to drive new data discovery and new access to information that could be helpful to our partners as well as other private sector participants.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned sort of unstructured data in particular, and that's interesting because I feel like the field of machine learning has sort of gone through various expansions and contractions,
Mhm.
being obsessed with trying to utilize unstructured data because there's so much of it, right? Um, it was sort of the 2010s, the early 2010s were all about what can I do with unstructured data, and then sort of more recently we had an obsession around structured data and sort of supervised learning that grew alongside that. And now with transformers, we're seeing sort of that buzz again around unstructured data. So maybe a question for you, Hanyu, is: are you seeing particular segments that maybe are getting a little extra attention because we have new technologies and new methods that can unlock new insights, maybe more specifically around unstructured data?
Yeah, I think for unstructured data specifically, I would go back to the distinction between a language and the people's language as a networked data and person specific data. One of the biggest domain areas that we're particularly excited about is the patents and intellectual property area. This is publicly available data that scattered around the world, different exists in different spaces internationally, and is ripe for language models to come in and process that for business users.
You're thinking like USPTO data, CNIPA data, sort of the various intellectual property ecosystems that exist all over
Yeah,
the world.
yeah. I'd also expand that to perhaps just scientific literature.
Mm.
Like maybe even just Google Scholar. And there's just a lot of text that contains a lot of interesting technological information, but it's hard to access, right? Especially for not just non-technical users, but people who are not experts in a very specific field of like 18th century art or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd even say that it's even as sort of a relative expert, right? It's hard to figure out where the overlaps are, right? Of
Right.
When you sort of see a new patent come across or a new scientific piece of literature, it's sort of hard to figure out where in the ecosystem does this fit, right? How much does this overlap with what's been done before? Where's the novelty? And maybe language models can help us parse that out.
Exactly. That's something I'm particularly excited for my personal use.
Awesome. And so maybe striding the market a different way, how do the business models vary for commercial data startups? And how do we evaluate these business models, Diana?
Yeah, and I would just say I would double tap Hanyu's comment around intellectual property and IP data and patent data just more broadly. I think this is one area that excites us that could be valuable to some of the folks we work with, but also, it's interesting as an investor and talking to some of my peers on the earlier stages and sides, some of this information can help even with just deal sourcing and trying to understand who's innovating, who's a subject matter expert, where their research might be differentiated. So I think there will be a lot of stones unturned in different use cases to emerge. When we think about the business models, as I mentioned, we're thinking about this in kind of a variety of different angles. We're looking at data sources themselves and different types of data sources. We're looking at vendors if they have direct access to that data or indirect access, as I was mentioning earlier. And then we're thinking about the end applications and the way that they deliver and provide continuous access to that information. So Hanyu and I collaborated a lot with both conversations with operators and investors in the space, as well as our government partners to really put together a framework both on how we think about this from an architecture perspective, something InQtel is often closely evaluating different industries and segments on. And then also we put together a framework for how we would continuously evaluate these types of businesses and think about the moats that these businesses might have and when that might signal to us that there is a stronger moat and reason for us to invest and be involved, or maybe something that's not as differentiated in the space. So the current framework that we put together really includes 6 parameters to help guide us in evaluating these commercial data businesses. And we look at factors including proprietary data. Is the data actually proprietary or exclusive to the vendor? How novel and unique is the data? How hard is it to obtain? And really, how relevant and unique could the data be to some of our partners' mission needs? A third parameter we think about is scale and breadth, which I think is very important when we're talking about the sheer volume out there. So what is the underlying volume that this data is covering, and across what time horizon and geography is the data set encompassing. We think a lot about compliance, as Hanyu was talking about some of the regulatory changes in this space, and we really want to ensure that the companies that we work with are adhering to some of the regulatory, legal, and even ethical expectations that our partners and the US government at large is increasingly focusing on in the data collection process. And we want them to be transparent and providing visibility on their own processes and sources when we're working with them. We think about quality and fidelity of the data itself, and whether that data is changing in its attributes over time and how reliable that information may be. And lastly, we're paying a lot of attention to the user experience and the access of working with that data and that vendor. So we're increasingly seeing more opportunity for the data to be packaged into a specific product platform with its own analytical layers and embedded solutions, as opposed to maybe in years past where the data was just provided directly via a flat file or API access. There's many modes of delivery that could encourage different types of user experiences, because not everyone that interacts with the vendor may be a savant data scientist like yourself, Ari. We may have a lot of newer and less technical users that could equally gain value and benefit from the information. So we are also evaluating really kind of the product delivery and the UX overall in the vendors that we're speaking with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to pull on this a little more, you mentioned some of the big hitters in the space, right? Your Dun & Bradstreets, your Bloombergs, right? And that we've sort of seen companies evolve to Series C, Series D. What do these companies look like as they mature, and how do they change?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question. One of the things that we see is that there's a continued drive. You see this at the later stages of the market with those vendors that you're describing. There's a continued drive to accumulate more data assets and more unique, rich information, which I think creates a pretty healthy strategic M&A market. And some of the things that we've seen with some of our own portfolio companies and others as they mature is they really are seeing a lot of attention from enterprise users applying the data and information in new ways. So our partners, in many cases, they are in an information business. They are using information to drive insight and decision making. But as we were saying earlier, the market as a whole in the private sector, we are increasingly embracing data to drive decision making. So even Fortune 100 entities in retail and consumer goods and other areas are increasingly attracted to data vendors and creating new engagements to work with these vendors. So we're seeing really a diversity in terms of the paying customer segments that these companies attract, as well as average contract value. We see a diversity in terms of how these partners engage. More customers are willing to engage with a full software solution where the portfolio company is not just delivering data, but they're kind of getting 1 and 2 steps ahead of delivering that data and providing the insight that the portfolio company's internal team is seeing to help kind of ease the burden of extracting insights. So really a lot of evolution there. And then we've looked at a lot of marketplaces for data discovery as well. Hanyu can also weigh in there, where we're seeing just a lot of access and new methods for private sector operators to share their information and commercialize their assets. So that's creating a lot of new attention that our portfolio companies sometimes can benefit from as a distribution channel, sometimes compete with, and can explore further to understand where they may have new market opportunities.
Yeah, and sort of along those lines, right? How has the customer side of the experience changed? Meaning, like, if I'm wanting to share and discover data, right, and I have a question in mind and I'm trying to find a data-driven answer, how would I identify the right commercial data provider, and how could I expect to access their data? Hanyu, do you have some thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ari. Yeah, just to bring it back to, we've touched on this before, but there's a lot more data being produced in various sets of different companies. And so we're seeing a lot of companies that fill the gap between those commercial data producers and the buyers who want that data. These companies are middlemen, they're marketplaces, but often sort of middleman has a derogatory term, or it's not something great because you want to go directly to the source. But what's important to remember is often the direct suppliers of data, they are not their 9 to 5 day job is not around producing that data. So, for example, you might be a vitamin sales company, and your job is to sell vitamins to people throughout the United States. And it turns out, because you're a good business and it's going well, you have accumulated a huge amount of data about the vitamin preferences of people in different regions throughout the United States, perhaps throughout the world. And of course, that data is enormously valuable to, for example, like public health agencies. Maybe you're curious about where vitamin C sales are spiking because that's correlated with flu or the cold. Maybe you're a hedge fund who's just interested in knowing the trends in vitamin sales. But that's very, very valuable. But that vitamin company's day to day, they don't necessarily have the time or the resources or the skill set to auction that data off in a public marketplace. So we're seeing a rise in middlemen in marketplaces, and we're excited about quite a wide variety of companies who are making that interface easier, allowing buyers to connect with sellers in a way that sellers can provide their data easily, quickly, and conveniently.
Yeah, specifically on that convenient point, have you seen these sort of, you call them middlemen, data platforms you could think of? Are they like homogenizing the data that's been given to them, sort of giving it to you in a uniform format so you can sort of interact with any of these data assets via sort of a consolidated API? Are you seeing that in this market?
That's an interesting point. Well, some do, some don't.
Okay.
The thing about consolidation and aggregation is it requires work by that middleman. So it costs more money, right? It also introduces a bias, right? So if the middleman, has done the work to post-process vendor A and not vendor B, they'll want you to go with vendor A and not vendor B because they've already done the work, right? And so I think aggregation and homogenization is helpful, especially, data infrastructure is tough. But I would prefer, and I'm more excited about vendors who actually introduce middlemen who introduce vendors to customers directly and actually do very little homogenization work, simply because they have no motive to prefer some vendors over others.
That makes a lot of sense. We're almost at time here, so we'll do sort of a quick hit for both of you to close us out. Starting with Diana, why should VCs be paying attention in this space?
Absolutely. So I think overall, VCs should pay attention here in the same way that I think In-Q-Tel should continue to pay attention here, is that this is still a very exciting space to continue to engage with, where we expect continued company formation, we expect solid exit opportunities, and we see many ways for operators to provide unique value with the data they work with over the next decade. And we expect that will go hand in hand with all of the innovation we're seeing around us, around the embrace of AI. So we think it's a critical area for the investment community to pay attention to, and just a space that we're very excited about.
Wonderful. And then Hanyu, why should the national security community pay attention, and our partners specifically?
Yeah, very simply, commercial data is an incredibly valuable and oftentimes unique set of information about the world. And for our government partners, if you care about the world, then you should be caring about commercial data.
Wonderful. Short and sweet. Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you all for tuning in to today's episode of IQT Explains. Please make sure to subscribe to the IQT podcast so you don't miss out on future content, and leave us a review or comment to let us know what you think, or what content you'd like to see us cover on a future podcast. I also encourage you to check out IQT's website at www.iqt.org to explore more content and learn about IQT's global investment platform that accelerates the introduction of groundbreaking technologies to enhance the national security and prosperity of America and its allies. Thanks.